Hey, everybody. It is the live stream. It's live stream number 50, the big 50. Cheers, everybody. Well, I don't know what they say anymore. 50 is the new 40, 40 is the new 30. We're not over the hill by any means.
The golden episode, as Rich Bates here in the chat.
Is it golden? Is it the golden one? Is that what people are saying? Yeah, it's our 50th episode. Hard to believe that we've already gone through 50. And it's really fun because when we sort of think about how this all started, we just kind of randomly started, streaming questions on LinkedIn. I think it was like on just Fridays. And it was just kind of whatever. I remember we used to put the questions on the green screen.
I remember that.
Behind us. It was just kind of really janky or whatever. And it kind of took off from there. And now we've been doing it for 50 whole episodes, which is amazing. So thanks everybody who's been here for 50 episodes. If you're new, we do this every week. We do it every Friday. We do it live. So you can put your questions in chat on LinkedIn or on YouTube, and we'll try our best to answer them. You can go to CUIHotline.org. We have a number you can call to leave your message with your question there. There's a form you can fill out, which is especially good for longer questions. Even though we do the show for a solid hour of just questions, we still don't have enough time to get to everything. So we'll add it to the queue and then roll it into the next week's episode if we don't get to it. And Daniel, we've got some of the all-time classics, the evergreen questions that we went through and tallied up the most common questions over 50 episodes, which was pretty fun to do because we get the sensation that we answer a lot of the same questions every week, but it's always very interesting to see what the most common questions are. But we'll take everybody's questions in chat just like normal. What do you think, Daniel? 50 episodes. What do you think?
You know what? What's fascinating to me is the number of new people that have joined us kind of throughout these 50 episodes, going back to when we were reviewing all the questions of like the top questions ever asked. You just realize like it's the same question asked by different people over these past 50 episodes, these 50 or so weeks we've been doing this. And so I think it's cool just to see more people emerging in the industry trying to figure out this problem for their organization, or they could be consultants trying to figure out how to best serve their clients. And I just really like that we're able to give this level of education to the masses. For those that haven't really watched a lot of us, feel like ask any question you want. Like Jacob and I are probably pretty well versed at this point to throw anything at us. There really isn't a stupid question in the sense of like if you're trying to learn and you've done a Google search and you're still unclear, then ask it, not the let me Google it for you type stuff. But yeah, we appreciate everyone's support. We love doing this. We love that there's a community around CMMC and regulations, cyber regulations that really wants to latch on and do the right thing. And so welcome to new people. And for people like Dark Green, who's been around for many, many, many moons, thanks for sticking around.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's jump right into it, Daniel. You and I were just in the Fort Worth area 2 days ago. I can't even remember. We were just at an event doing Summit 7 Live. We've got one coming up next week in Huntsville. So if you guys are in the area, you can check that out. And you were talking about CMMC Level 1 strategy. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that people don't really think about, it's like, okay, like Army Corps of Engineers, like they're starting to like really kind of look at CMMC Level 1 for initial solicitations post November 10th. And people are like, oh, I just need to be CMMC Level 1. I was like, that's not a bad idea, right? Obviously, right? If that's what the contract requires, it's fully self-attest. What I'm seeing people misstep on is that they're starting to implement technical controls like this in their commercial tenant. And in reality, if you ever have a plan of going to level 2, what I've been telling people is it's probably best to go ahead and do the big painful thing, which is migrating to a Gov Cloud, then implement level 1. And then from there, you can kind of upscale it to CMMC level 2 requirements. And here's the main reason. CMMC Level 1 doesn't have a FedRAMP requirement for cloud providers, right? For federal contracting information.
Yep.
However, if you start kind of building and getting momentum there, and then you want to do Level 2 after you've grown the organization because of the contracts you've won from Level 1, then at that point, you've got to do the painful thing of going to a Gov Cloud and re-implementing all of those controls all over again, plus more.
Yep.
And so what I've been telling people, if you want to do CMMC Level 1, the best way to do it, to be able to do it easily at scale, is go ahead and do the painful thing, migrate to a compliant cloud provider, implement the 17 practices in CMMC Level 1, that map back to FAR 52.204.21, and thumbs up, do it. That way you can start incrementing into your level 2, right? You don't have to do level 2 immediately, but you can start implementing those controls systematically through change control up until the point that you're ready to go through a level 2 assessment. Because if you do it the other way and you implement level 1 in a commercial cloud, that's great, but then you have to redo all of that work, and there's not incremental work you can do for level 2 in the midst of your level 1 because it's a completely different cloud. So anyways, that's my kind of recommendation for level 1. Still look at a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent cloud provider for processing, storing, and transmitting CUI, which is the requirement for level 2. But yeah, pick the cloud provider that's compliant, implement the level 1 controls, and that way you can scale and upgrade easily is the summary.
Yeah, and it's, it's a really interesting point because it's like, yeah, maturity model is in the name, but CMMC is not a maturity model because the requirements that it verifies were not designed to be a scale of maturity.
Yep.
Right? The requirements at FAR 52.204.21 are not necessarily the points that you would implement in order to then implement the rest of the requirements in 800.171. That's not how they were originally intended to work. That's just sort of how the cookie crumbled and they sort of glossed over everything and called it a maturity model. But it's a really good point is you've got other, if the requirements at FAR 52.204.21 are not the maturity starting points for the rest of 171, they're not bad starting points, but they're not necessarily where you would start if you were starting from 0. The requirements of the clause FAR 52.204.21 are not a stepping scale of maturity towards the other requirements in DFAR 7012. Like you said, like going from 0 FedRAMP to FedRAMP is a maturity scale.
Yes.
Of course, that's not really a part of the CMMC program, so you can't really blame CMMC for not dealing with that. But that is a good point where people are like, we'll just do level 1. And it's like, you're going to be in a commercial tenant, non-FedRAMP, this and that. And then you're going to have to switch over to level 2. It's like, it would be easier for you to just go to level 2.
Yep.
Probably less expensive for sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. All right. One thing I wanted to talk about with people is a point that I was stressing when I was in Fort Worth earlier this week, and something I've seen coming up is it's very important to understand the relationship between the 48 CFR final rule and the 32 CFR final rule, in the sense that there is nothing in the 48 CFR final rule that changes CMMC policy, right? The 48 CFR final rule implements the policy at 32 CFR 170, the rule that went into effect in December. It implements that policy in contracts. And it really does that in 2 ways. It implements it as guidance for the contract workforce and in the specific language that will show up in your contract clause and solicitation provision 7021 and 7025, respectively. One of the reasons it's important to know is that there's no surprises. There's no gotchas. There's no Easter eggs. There's no nothing going on inside the rule. It's just taking language directly from 32 CFR 170 and putting it into contract regulation, which is why we did the podcast this week explaining what is 252.204.70.25, this new solicitation provision. Every time they go through and they say what requirements are, they link to 32 CFR 170.19.23.5. this, that, because it's downstream from that policy. This is also worth knowing for the people out there who themselves or their leadership or crazy person on the corner of the intersection yelling about how CMMC is not happening. 48 CFR CMMC is implementing a policy that's already in effect.
Yep.
Right. So the idea that this policy wouldn't go into effect doesn't make any sense because the big policy already got the green light. It's already been in effect for almost a year. So, it's not an additional rule. It's not new policy. It's not changing policy. It's just implementing policy even further. And that's just something that people should keep in mind as they're thinking about it. Like I was just doing an interview this morning and somebody said, one of their first questions was, were you surprised by anything in the rule? And I was like, no, we already knew kind of what was going to be in there from the proposed rule and downstream from 32 CFR. Now, when new rulemaking happens in the future for what you could casually refer to as CMMC 3.0, the revision and update to 32 CFR CMMC policy, that's when they could change POAM guidance, they could change waiver guidance, they could change organizationally defined parameter guidance, they could change all that stuff. That's when you could see big changes. And then once that's done, it would then be reflected in 48 CFR and so on and so forth. So the 32 CFR rulemaking cycles are the ones where big changes could potentially happen. 48 CFR cycles are pretty routine. So just something for everybody to keep in mind.
Well, so one interesting follow-up to that, and we talked about this a little bit when we were in Dallas, Jacob, but there were people in Dallas, Fort Worth, when we did our Summit 7 live event, that came up to us and said, yeah, my executives still don't want us to do CMMC, even though 48 CFR is now officially out. And there's a date of November 10th.
Yeah.
They're basically saying like, hey, until it's actually in solicitations as a requirement, we will not be moving forward with implementing the controls, which is just crazy, right? Because you have 32 CFR, which is the program, to your point. You have 48 CFR, which is the ability to contractually require a CMMC level on a contract for the DoD. And people are, and you have a date of November 10th. And people are still basically like, nah, not until it's like a real thing. Or in my opinion, and we've talked about this too, not until my prime tells me I have to do it, right? At a minimum. Still waiting on that Lockheed blog to drop. I'm sure it's going to be.
I think it's going to be the effective date. I don't think they're going to drop the blog. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I thought it was going to be the week the final rule was published and we had a date. You know, you and I had a bet. I was like, I think it's going to be before the end of the week. Now, looking back at the Lockheed memos that they've published on their website, they almost always published when the rules went into effect or after the rules were published. So something tells me that we might not get the Lockheed blog that says, hey, you got your boots tied up, time to go, until November 10th, which would be, you know, their prerogative, but that's definitely going to surprise some people. So it was pretty crazy to hear people, you know, say like, we've got a date for the start of the phase rollout. We know what's going on. And they're like, until we see it, we're not doing it, which, hey, you know, run your business however you want to. That's why I recommend to people, go to your customer's long-range acquisition forecast. So if you do contract work for NAVWAR, NAVC, Missile Defense Agency, whoever, you can go to their supplier websites most of the time, and they're going to have a long-range acquisition forecast, which is typically a spreadsheet that you can download that has all of their planned solicitations for the next fiscal year. And there are fields in the spreadsheets that say we plan on advertising the solicitation in Q3 of FY26, and we plan on awarding the contract in Q4 of FY26. Or sometimes it'll even be in the same quarter.
Yeah.
And so if you're like, we're going for that work, then you know when you see the solicitation that could have a CMMC level 2 certification requirement, you might have to have your certification within the same quarter that you see the solicitation. If you think that you can delay your implementation and get ready in that period of time, wonderful. Right. Just realize you got to have it in order to take award. And I think a lot of people aren't putting that piece together. So they're taking a bigger risk than they're aware of. So take the risk if you want, just be aware of the nature of the risk is my
absolutely.
So there you go. All righty, let's see here. Tons of props on 50. Megan's here.
Hey, Megan.
Megan's always here. She's always commenting on the LinkedIn post too. So thanks for stopping by, Megan. People are super stoked about this. Let's see. Justin said, is FIPS required for access points if the access points are behind a FIPS firewall?
So this is where the fun, like, compensating control things comes in. Same thing with like switches, right? So now we had a conversation through LinkedIn, and I can't remember who it was with, Jacob, anyways, about this kind of same requirement. So switches and access points sit inside of your facility. However, access points do have the ability to have a radius outside of your building. So there's some things to be aware of there. But when you're looking at CUI, there's two ways to protect CUI, very high level: encryption with FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography, or physically compensating controls. And so on the access point piece of it, if I have full control and access to the people on that network, the systems connecting to that network, and it's all being routed internally, not a problem. That's why your firewall, for example, being your boundary device, needs to be FIPS validated, right? Because it's facing external, right? That's the intent of it. But things internally, you can have physical compensating controls on those systems to basically show, hey, here is how I'm meeting this requirement of protecting the confidentiality of CUI on that system. Switches and access points are good examples of that. Now, most people, quite honestly, just to be able to more easily check the box and not have to defend their position, decide to enable FIPS validated cryptography on their switches and access points. And if you're doing like a enclave environment and you're logically using the same network as your commercial network, yeah, you need to be at the higher of the two standards, unless, of course, again, physical compensating controls. But end of the day, encrypt the CUI to the requirement or have physical controls in place so that you can show cover sheets, physical, access to buildings and rooms and all that good stuff, and you'll be good to go.
Gotcha. Let's see here. Yeah, Justin, good question. Justin says, thanks for stopping by. Let's see. What are the obligations for managed service providers when the managed service provider only manages logs and monitoring? So they're not handling
level 3. So sorry. No, I'm just just kidding, pal. Okay, so there's a couple of nuances here to this question. So at the minimum, you have to produce a customer responsibility matrix of the controls that you're managing or supporting on behalf of the client. That's minimum. That's the 110 controls plus the 320 assessment objectives downstream. However, there's two other things to be aware of. Security logs from a commercial legal entity is not CUI, right? So, so the actual data you have is not going to be controlled and classified information. So that's good. However, if you are using outsource SOC teams or any level of outsource support that will have the ability to not only not necessarily see the logs, but be able to remediate things with administrative access on those systems and they're non-US persons, that's where the flag comes on the play, right? So the actual logs themselves, not CUI. However, if you're using an endpoint detection and response tool, an EDR tool, and it's doing sandboxing of files and things like that, obviously you can't control if it's looking at CUI or not. We need to move that to a FedRAMP cloud. So the tool set you're using from anything that processes, stores, and transmits CUI like EDR has to meet FedRAMP requirements. Logs themselves and a SIEM itself is not considered CUI, although it would be a security protection asset. And then long stretch of time, you can look at the support structure, right? If the people accessing and doing remediation of these events or incidents are non-US persons and they're on systems or they're accessing systems that have unencrypted technical information that's export control, that's a violation. So there's multiple different layers of this, you could say, depending on all of the different services your MSP is actually providing to them.
Awesome. All right, Vince Scott is here, a good friend who's been around the ecosystem for a long time. So Vince had an awesome comment on our podcast from this week over on the YouTube side. So we were talking about this new solicitation provision 252.204.7025. So this is a provision that goes into solicitations that literally makes you aware of the requirements in the clause 252.204.7021. So this is like DFAR 7008 is the provision that makes you aware of 7012. DFAR 7019 is the one that makes you aware of 7020. Now 7025 is the thing that makes you aware of 7021. The numbering is arbitrary, which is very annoying, but that's just how it works. So anyways, when you read through this provision and through the clause, there's language in there that says that you need to provide your CMMC unique identifier in your, essentially in your bid to the solicitation so that they know, what's going to be involved. And your CMMC unique identifier is this 10-digit alphanumeric identifier that corresponds with the scope of the CMMC, this contractor information system, right? So your CMMC status is pinned to that CMMC UID. The problem is that the DoD has always told everybody, well, CMMC is not a requirement to bid. It's a requirement at the time of award. But if I have to provide you with a CMMC UID prior to the award, don't I have to have CMMC prior to award? And this is not at all clear in the language of the rule. It seems like the way that the DoD intends for this to be is that you would have already been started on this process necessarily. And so you would have some entry in SPRS, even though they're not going to look for the final status until award. But it is a good point. I'm sure there's probably some rationale that the DoD has in terms of the fact that they're not asking you for final status at the time that you're bidding. They're only checking your required status when they go to award the contract. But then clearly you must have had the process underway in order to respond to the solicitation. So yeah, it's definitely weird, and it's not at all clear. I don't know if that would bridge over into the territory of qualifying as you need to have a status in order to bid, but you would have had to have initiated a process with what's going on. I'm also pretty sure that something that the DoD would say, if I put on my hat, they would go, well, if you're still working on the process, all you have to do is notify in your offer that this process is underway and you plan to get it. So like most things, the burden would be on you to provide the information rather than there being some clear mechanism here. So it's a great point. It's something that people have to be aware of. It is true, you don't need your final status until award, but you have to produce CMMC UIDs in response to the solicitation. I guess that, you know, there's ways to navigate that, but yeah, it's not very clean. So it is a good point. Yeah, it's a good point for sure.
And that's the thing. The DoD said that they weren't going to require CMMC at time of bid, but they're a little sneaky. They just slipped something in there, I think, is probably what they did.
And that's the thing that we've been telling people about the procurement administrative lead time thing is if you are, you know, like Joyce is saying, it's crazy to wait for it in contracts because it shows up in solicitations and you won't have enough time between award and verification. Yeah, that's exactly the point. So if you look on the long range acquisition forecast and there's an opportunity you want to bid on in Q3 and they're going to award the contract in Q3, then you have to start before the solicitation comes out in order to be ready. So even though it is technically true that you don't need a final status until the contract is awarded, you have to have started on something before you see this solicitation requirement. You don't need to do that. Technically, it's not required for you to do it to bid, but you kind of have to do it in order to be ready in time. So it's one of those like, hey, like you don't have to have it for you know, in order to bid, but you also have no hope of being able to bid if you don't have it, kind of a thing, right? So yeah, it is pretty weird. All right, Nicholas says, Nicholas has also been around on multiple episodes. Yeah. Shout out to you. What should I ask for or from my external service providers who are security protection assets to ensure they are prepared for the level 2 assessment? They haven't gotten deep into the CMMC rabbit hole before, to my knowledge. So Daniel, you're relying on some external providers to do some degree of work.
Yep.
They're not very involved in the CMMC world. What do you think would happen here? I know we've talked to lots of people who have either they've gotten overpromised from their providers or they weren't really sure what the relationship was. What do you think here?
So here's what I have found very quickly, and it kind of goes back to my level 1 comment, but I want to pull up something really fast. Nope, I can't find it. Never mind. Okay, I'll just talk to it. So what most MSPs are doing that I've seen as a reaction to CMMC being real, number one, the market is going to start getting more and more saturated, right? Because it's a money grab, right? So many people need CMMC. As an MSP, I want to take full advantage of that. And we actually answered this question in Dallas, Fort Worth at Summit 7 Live. The thing they're doing is they might be able to produce a shared responsibility matrix or a customer responsibility matrix, CRM. However, a lot of the times they're not mapping their tools to the FedRAMP cloud versions that are actually processing, storing, and transmitting CUI on your behalf. So what we've seen is, number one, you need to ask for that customer responsibility matrix for things in the maintenance family, incident response family, so forth and so on, right? The full 110, 320 assessment objectives. But going back to it, a lot of MSPs are like, oh yeah, here's that piece of paper that their vendor provided them, and they're just copying and pasting it over. Like, oh, you're using Huntress. Oh, you're using Arctic Wolf. Oh, you're using, so here's their SRM for you. Number one, they typically don't inject what they're actually doing from their labor perspective. So you need to clarify that. And number two, you need to validate, are any of their systems supporting you processing, storing, or transmitting CUI? And if they are, those need to be FedRAMP tools. The problem is most MSPs don't want to invest the amount of money it takes to elevate their whole client base. And they rarely want two parallel systems, right? A gov version and a commercial version. So it's going to take a lot for an MSP to kind of turn the ship or offer very limited services to their defense contractors, just because it's just going to be really just generally expensive. So customer responsibility matrix, make sure it's not just their vendors copy and paste PDF. Make sure it's one that's tailored for the work they're doing. Make sure that in your contract, the MSP agreement that you have with them, you have very strong terms around performance and showing up to audits and assessments. The amount of times that we've talked to people over the past few months that their MSP a year ago was like, absolutely, we got your back. We're going through the assessment with you. And then they get a phone call saying, yeah, we're actually like not going to do that anymore. Please go find somebody else, but you owe us for the rest of your contractual term.
Yeah.
And they're
I think a reliable way too is ask for proof that they've had people go through the process. I saw a comment on Reddit the other day, and I thought it was really great, where they were saying that, if you're shopping for help with this kind of stuff, and the policy rule has been in effect for almost a year, and they don't have a case study, they don't have a testimonial, they don't have something to say we've gotten people through this process, at least one, then that should be, a question. Because, like we've got them plastered all over our website. We've got the white papers you can download. We've got their video interviews on the YouTube channel, just to demonstrate that, like, you might not have wanted to go super early, but for the people that did, our solution, has been proven to work. So that way, because not everybody wants to be up at the front, which is totally fine. But you definitely want to ask for proof. If they're saying, no, we got it, and they have yet to walk anybody through the process, maybe be like, hey man, you got any receipts or anything we can check out?
Any receipts?
Yeah, that's why we got it scrolling across the bottom. We update it every week for how many people we've had go through the process. So, all right, Steven says, is FedRAMP required for IT help desk ticketing and asset management?
Good question. So asset management, traditional like CMDB type stuff, like usually not, right? If it's just truly inventory, the configuration baseline of that system, right? Memory, processor, software installed, etc. IT help desk ticketing can actually be a little tricky. And the reason is you can approach this two ways. Number one, if your users are able to send screenshots in your ticketing system, that's usually problematic because users don't typically scrub the screenshot before they're sending in a request. So you could end up with CUI or even export control data in your system, your ticketing system specifically. So there's two ways to kind of get around this. One, you move to a FedRAMP system, assuming that CUI is going to be involved in that system. Or number two, you write very strong policies that no CUI is allowed to exist, and you have your client's consent, or if you are the IT shop internally at someone, you basically have consent that no CUI will be submitted in screenshots, or you remove the screenshot capability altogether. So there's several different ways to kind of solve that problem, depending on your level of risk tolerance and how often you're seeing some of that stuff come through. One thing to be aware of that people miss out on all the time, and I bring this up because of asset management, is remote management and monitoring tool sets. So SolarWinds, Kaseya, ConnectWise, Datto, like all of those different RMM platforms that are now honestly starting to get bought out and unified. But the problem is FedRAMP. NinjaOne, I think, is in FedRAMP authorization. They are not fully authorized yet at a moderate level, I don't think. But there are no RMM tools that a traditional MSP might use, like Kaseya and ConnectWise, which is problematic because those things have file transfer, screen capture, so many different things you can enable, which would immediately bring that cloud system into scope as a CUI asset and therefore have to meet FedRAMP, which those tools today do not meet. So again, you have to get really surgical on policies and procedures and disabling things to really try and build, kind of a jank tech stack, right? Unless you're using compliant tool sets like we are here, because it just becomes very difficult. Because at that point, if you're having to compromise, you're going to compromise on your SLA times now because it's going to take longer to do things. You need to go and revise your agreement and contracts with your clients that are wanting to do this because they need to understand, hey, we're making these changes for you, but things are going to have to give. Prices are going to have to go up. More labor is going to be involved in touching that client, so forth. The response time might be slower, or resolution time actually might be slower. So again, all of these things have to be fleshed out and thought of, which is why we're seeing a lot of MSPs exit this, try and get into the CMMC space rapidly, and then quickly exiting when it comes to CMMC level 2, because they don't want to change their whole environment or 2 or 3 or 5 clients out of their 50 to 100 clients, right? It just doesn't make financial sense for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Joy said, what's your take on the request for investigation into Microsoft and the issue with servers with Chinese dev access? We've talked about this before. Hasn't affected any of our clients or any of the environments that we operate in. It's a good thing, right? It sounds like from the information that was publicly available that people are obeying the letter of the requirements, and nobody either inside the government or outside of it ever asked the follow-up questions. And so they were like, you're doing what now? Still haven't seen any of the details for exactly what that policy was or what the policy exception was or anything like that. But overall, if that is true, that was happening, then that's good that they stopped it, because like most of the publicly disclosed weirdness, all the way up into full-blown breaches like SolarWinds, OPM, things like that, we never really get the full story about who approved what, who looked the other way, who did what or didn't do what. But yeah, it's good because if they were doing it, then you can be guaranteed that other people were probably doing the same thing. And it sounded like it was happening for a long time. So,
and hey, the Secretary of Defense came out and charged the DoD CIO with full investigations, right, of all of the software providers now because of this. At least that's where I think the initiation came from. A couple of really interesting news. So Donald and Zero Logic just put in chat, and I just validated, Ninja One, that RMM tool, did reach FedRAMP moderate authorization. So if you are an MSP out there looking for a SaaS-based RMM tool, this would be the one to use.
Nice.
Just because they actually can check the box. They provide, again, that multi-client similar access you might be used to with like a Kaseya or a ConnectWise. That's great. So that would be a really good one to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Rich said, which subreddits within this specific space for subreddits, you can go to r/CMMC, r/NIST controls, and then to some degree r/government contracting. Although government contracting is usually discussions of people with creative ideas about why CMMC isn't happening, rather than strategies for actually tackling what's going on. But the CMMC and NIST controls subreddit are very good. In the sidebar, you can find the link to the Discord server that corresponds to the subreddit. And that is definitely the best place to go, because that's been the hive mind core of the collective thought around CMMC, NIST, FedRAMP, GCC High, Google, AWS, everything in between for years and years and years. And it's totally free. So most of the big voices, providers, implementers, assessors are there to some degree. Some of them are, they tell you who they are. Some of them are anonymized. Some of them are pseudonymous. But yeah, those subreddits are good. The CUI Discord server, as they call it, is definitely the place to go for breaking news, questions, memes, happy hour.
Great memes.
Yeah, it's a great resource. And it has been for years and years and years, and it's free. So definitely check it out. Elizabeth says, how reliable is the FAQ on the CIO website? It depends. I guess it depends on what guidance you're getting. They don't update it very often. Theoretically, it should be extremely reliable in terms of interpretations. I'm sure there's a lot of people in here that have seen that there are gaps between the FAQ on the CIO website, the FAQ on the procurement website. And so it kind of just depends on the specific situation, but it should be authoritative, should be something you should be able to point to. If there's a specific contradiction or anything like that that you find, let us know, and then we can probably dive into it. I'd have to double check and go back and look, but they don't update them very often. So the DFARS cybersecurity FAQ hasn't been updated in a couple of years at this point. But it's also because a lot of their policy guidance hasn't really changed. So hopefully we see some updates in there in a little bit.
Jacob, you said this at the event this week. PowerPoint is not policy.
Yeah.
Kind of extends a little bit to FAQs, although they are a position and interpretation of what the DoD or Department of War now, the DOW, I guess is how we say that.
Anyways, I mean, listen, chat, help us out here. Should we just refer to it as the Pentagon? Because if you listen to any of the confirmation hearings that have been going on this week, you know, the term Department of Defense is a term that was established through legislation. And so we've decided that we're going to change the name of it, but we haven't changed the law. So half the people you talk to are like, it's still the Department of Defense. Half the people call it the Department of War. I was just listening to a panel talk where Mark Montgomery, retired admiral, was up there. I love Mark Montgomery. I used to work for the guy when I was in the Navy. He keeps it real all the time. And he was saying Department of War. He's like, come on. He was like, let's all be real here. What should we call it? Department of War, Department of Defense, Pentagon, the Department, DBA, Department of War is hilarious.
DOD doing business as Department of War, like, God.
The DOW is hilarious. Yeah, so we'll probably come up with some horrific long thing to refer to it as, and it'll just be even harder for new people in the space to understand what we're talking about. Sorry, so what were you saying? What were we saying?
Basically, always point back and always reference back to the policy, because even things in FAQs they're not law, right? In the sense of like they're not the actual policy that was produced. So look at it, validate it honestly, like, because people who write those don't necessarily know all the time what's in 32 and 48 CFR. Incredibly smart people on both sides. But again, if you're making decisions not based off policy, but based off an FAQ, just hold that loosely, I guess, is probably, or a PowerPoint timeline slide that you've pointed out, Jacob, like with phased rollouts and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. All righty. Let's see. For a managed service provider that is responsible for audit, logging, and monitoring, is the expectation that they are manually reviewing the relevant logs, or does a tool like Huntress meet the requirements?
I think it depends on what you have defined as of what logs, number one, you're reviewing, how often you're reviewing them, or the systems are reviewing them to validate an event or an incident or not. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's like, I don't think a tool by itself can do all of the heavy lifting, if that's the question, right? I can't just say I have Huntress installed and that's good to go. Huntress should be able to provide a shared responsibility matrix stating how frequently their outsourced SOC team is doing the support and review of logs and responding to incidents. Those are going to be tied to SLAs, of course, and things like that. So I don't think you can just say, hey, I installed Huntress and walk away. You need to have more due diligence and a better definition of what that tool's doing on your behalf, or how you're also coming in and supporting the tool that you have deployed.
Yeah. Blake said the UID issue sounds similar to how primes share RFP information to bidding contractors. Pre-award, they possibly never actually get the contract awarded. And if the RFP has federal contract information or CUI in it, then what? It's a similar problem. Yeah, it's a good point. So, you know, in some situations, CUI needs to be sent for people in order to bid on the work, but people have to have the requirements implemented to handle the CUI. You're not supposed to send the CUI to people who can't prove that they've implemented the requirements. So now what do? Right? This is all pre-award work. Yep. And it's a whole, right? The regulation is not perfect. There are gaps, there are wrinkles, there are warts, there are issues that have yet to be solved, if they can even be solved at all. And so it's definitely a gap in the situation. If I were the Ministry of State Security, I would stand up all kinds of contractors with no hope of ever winning a contract award, and then just get the RFP information and then go from there, because you can get that very easily. So absolutely.
I want to go back to Elizabeth's follow-up here. The CIO FAQ says MSPs, even with ARM and Maxis, do not have to be CMMC certified. So MSPs with the final rule 32 CFR do not have to be certified. Hard stop. They don't have to be. They realized the burden of getting MSP certified would be too significant. The funny thing is, I think probably a fair portion of the certifications that have been done so far are probably MSPs, probably 20%, I think would probably be a fair
Which is
estimate.
good. That's definitely what should happen for sure.
But that does not think of them more as an extension of your corporate IT systems is probably the better way to look at that. So if they're not using FedRAMP clouds that are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, that's going to be a ding on you. And then again, you will not be able to pass said assessment. So RMM tools can, and this is where it gets really tricky, RMM tools can be configured to be out of scope for CUI and just be security protection assets with security protection data if it's configured correctly. So this is kind of that dance of, yes, you can have RMM, you can have it out of scope for CUI if you have, outlines of how CUI or technical implementations that are getting implemented to exclude CUI. Just be very careful walking down that path, because MSPs period will not have to be CMMC certified, at least now. RMM tools can be configured to not have CUI. Again, you're going to disable services likely as part of that. But if your MSP is not using compliant tools that are processing, storing, and transmitting CUI, it'll be a ding on your assessment and potentially end in a failure, right? Very likely.
Yeah. Alrighty. Can you please explain the reason for requiring FedRAMP moderate or equivalent for email communications? Okay. I understand that contractors email CUI to their subs and vice versa. What else is required to configure to protect accidental disclosure of CUI over email?
So encrypting, so like Azure Rights Management, purview labels inside of M365, encrypting the actual CUI that you're sending is another mechanism you can use. That does not trump needing the FedRAMP requirement, right? So you're going to have one and the same. So encrypting the data, marking the data, and being in a FedRAMP cloud are the three really big things. And then if you're receiving CUI, you need to add on there being able to scan external sources. So a FedRAMP compliant spam filter as well, because now you have CUI entering your environment, right? So that thing doing the scanning. So we use Defender for O365 as our set to do that because of GCC high, but you'd have to use some sort of spam filter for email coming into your organization as well.
Yeah. All right. We got some form questions on CUIHotline.org. You guys can always submit questions over there. Somebody said, can you comment on CUI controls as it pertains to the relationship between state guard entities and National Guard entities? Since these are non-contractual relationships, what controls or frameworks are in place to address CUI in the exchange of information from the federal side?
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, so they're asking if CUI is exchanged between like state guard entities and National Guard entities. Okay. What sorts of requirements are in place for protecting CUI? They're not contracts, so they're not receiving this pursuant to a contract, but they're handling CUI. So what are their requirements for state guard, National Guard type stuff? We've had questions like this in the past where people are like, I do work at the state level. What are my requirements? As far as CMMC is concerned, DFARS requirements are concerned, those are contractual mechanisms. So if you're not in a contract, but you're receiving the data, you're outside of the scope of what's going on. To some degree, things like OTAs and, non-traditional contract, non-contract type of acquisition relationships, even that's a little bit of a gray area. The DoD has said that if you're handling CUI over there, you're still going to have these obligations, but you don't actually have a contract with DFARS clauses in it. So nobody really knows how that's going to work. Within the scope strictly of what we're talking about, if you don't have something that is going to say you have DFARS 7008, 7012, 7025, 7021, I don't know how you would get that obligation to have these requirements. So keep your ear to the ground, but it's not in you don't have a contract, so you're not bound by the contract. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I've looked into this before, and states don't have their own, kind of like the state ramp, which is now, what is it, Jacob? Gov ramp, I think, or something like that.
I can't remember. I mean, it seems like there's some individual states have like their own ramp, like
right.
Text ramp, and then I don't know.
So there is no equivalent of a CUI requirement on a per state basis. So state ramp is GovRamp now. So you have FedRamp, you have FedRamp, GovRamp, right? So it's like, anyways. But yeah, I've not seen any mechanism to flow down from the federal government to like National Guard, state-based National Guards, and things like that. So yeah, I'd be curious if you're out there and you know the answer. Please let us know.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting for sure. All right, Sandy says, anybody pointing to the DoD revamp of the risk management framework as a CMMC killer sounds like an easy resource for doubters. Yeah, I think that the doubters at this point are going to point to planetary alignment, tide schedules, the phases of the moon to say that CMMC isn't happening. DoD revamping RMF has nothing to do with the CMMC program. It's so funny too to hear people point to this, because for years I've tried to convince people that CMMC is really a type of version of the RMF approach. And people were like, no, it's not. No, it's not. It's different. And now they're saying they're going to revamp RMF. And people go, hey, this is directly related to CMMC. CMMC is a slow motion version of the RMF, but under no circumstances is it under the umbrella of the risk management framework. So for those of you that aren't aware, Katie Arrington has talked about blowing up the RMF. They want to revamp it, revise it, overhaul the RMF process. I'm very skeptical about what she's talking about. We're supposed to see that guidance, I think, before the end of November for what their idea is. A lot of the times you hear criticisms about RMF, and it's usually people pointing to things that are already features of the RMF that people just don't do. So like, for instance, one of the former Navy CIOs was constantly harping on the RMF for not being good at continuous monitoring, and we needed to do continuous monitoring. And I was like, hey man, the last step of RMF is continuous monitoring. You're just not doing it. So right. If you do the thing that RMF says, then you're doing the thing that you're saying that RMF doesn't have. A lot of people will point to like how long the process takes. There's no feature in RMF that says that you have to take a long time. You're just pointing and dropping what is a otherwise pretty reasonable set of steps into a bureaucratic culture that takes a long time to do anything, and then blaming the framework for the culture, right? So we'll see what the overhaul says. I am very skeptical that dropping a new version of the RMF is going to make things go faster. For instance, one of the big criticisms of ATOs and RMF is that there isn't reciprocity. If you read 837 or 853, that's all they talk about is the importance of having a standard process for reaching an authorization decision so you could have reciprocity. But DoD authorizing officials don't trust each other. That has nothing to do with the RMF framework by itself. So unless you somehow get them to trust each other, or you make them trust each other, then I'm not sure how the overhaul is going to work. But anyways, to Sandy's point here, changing the RMF, getting rid of the RMF has nothing to do with CMMC as a program, even if the baseline that CMMC verifies is sort of the output of an RMF-like process. They're not directly related in any way. Let's see. Are you saying people aren't saying what they claim to be doing when it comes to RMF? Sounds like a path to CMMC about 6 years ago.
God.
The RMF process has been, the same process for a long time, right? And it's, I was doing RMF and ATO packages for a long time for, satellite systems and different Air Force and now Space Force programs. And, NIST outlines a general framework, and that general framework gets plopped into what's going. FedRamp is an RMF, instance, right? It follows the same RMF type of procedures. So yeah, you can go faster through decisions, policy, training, whatever. I don't know if, and we'll see what the overhaul looks like. I don't know if blowing up the RMF is solving the problem, but you never know. We went from DIACAP and DITSCAP to RMF, and we overhauled the frameworks and changed it and made it more clear and blah, blah, blah. And now we're on RMF 2.0, and you still have the same problem inside of the DoD. So maybe the fourth or fifth time is the charm. There's a really excellent book that was written a couple years ago called Recoding America by Jennifer Polka. And there's a chapter in there where she talks about 853 and security controls and things like that. And she even mentions it's not a book on cybersecurity or anything like that. She's just talking about culture and why things are so slow in the government. But that chapter is particularly interesting because she says that in the guidance, in the NIST guidance, it says that the moderate baseline is not an all or nothing baseline. You can vary from the baseline. It's up to you to pick and choose from the catalog of controls. The baselines are really just kind of like your default character on your character selection screen. You can change the hair and the eye color and the clothes and like all the stuff, but nobody ever does it because they don't want to take the risk. Like they don't want to deal with it. So they just take the default baseline. So it's like, is the solution more baselines, different baselines, or is there a larger issue going on? So, okay, there you go.
I mean, we can't not put up this comment, Jacob.
Who is this person?
Who is this person?
Hard to evaluate RMF as a failure when few, if any, systems have actually fully implemented the framework. If you want to know the dark, dirty secrets of RMF weirdness, cutting corners, then you need to speak to my magnificent and intelligent wife, Miss Shauna Horn. She will tell you what's going on. Everybody give her a follow on LinkedIn. Go pester her in the DMs, and then she can tell you all about it. She knows way more about it than I do. Half the stuff I talk about at RMF, I just repeat based off what I hear her yelling about when she comes home from work. So there you go. All righty. Another hotline question on the form on the hotline website. Alrighty, I am affiliated with a general contractor moving into the DIB space. They work with dozens of subcontractors on each contract, and the subs are different on each contract. So large supply chain here. To my knowledge, none of the subcontractors are CMMC certified or would have an acceptable SPRS score.
Okay.
I'm no expert, but given what I know about scoping and flowdown, this seems like it might be an inherently incompatible model with DFARS and CMMC requirements. It seems too complicated to be realistic. It seems to me that a pool of dedicated compliant subcontractors would be needed to pass an assessment, and even then the assessment scope would be crazy without anyone having the certifications yet. Am I getting this right? Is that pretty much all correct?
Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, not only is it a problem, here's the thing, Jacob, you and I were talking about this. Like, the big problem is DFAR 7012 this whole time has had contractual flowdowns to your supply chain.
Right.
So when we're talking to organizations, they're like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? It's like, what have you been doing? Like, what is that? The last 9 years, 2016, end of 2017, right? Like, what have you been doing? And the answer is no one's been doing anything about this. So you are right. It is going to be a big problem for flowdowns. A lot of the larger organizations we talk to these days, you know, they have the ability to write the check to get compliant. What they don't have the ability to do is solve for their 50, 100, 150, 200 suppliers or thousands of suppliers that they have and making sure that they're compliant. That supply chain risk program should have been spun up 8 years ago to deal with the DFAR 7012 requirements, and a little survey form people fill out is not sufficient, right? So, yeah, I mean, the person that asked that question, like, you're not wrong. It's going to be painful. You're going to have a lot fewer suppliers. The supply chain is going to consolidate. The DoD is hyper aware of this. But if you can't protect the data to the requirements, they don't want you working with them. That's how the DoD and DOW are positioning this whole thing.
Yeah, and they say it in the 7025 provision and the 7021 clause now, where they were like, the contractor shall not give the data to subcontractors if they don't have proof that they have implemented the corresponding requirements, right?
Yep.
Like, you are making the decision to send controlled data to people who have not proven that they meet the requirements for receiving the data. So if you do that, that's on you, right? And the DoD to this point has said they're going to do this. It's been a requirement in current DoD contract clauses. It is now going to be verified with upcoming contract clauses starting November 10th. So yeah, primes or people with supply chains are in a real pickle because this has been a slow moving train, but it's still a train and you're on the train tracks here. So you got to figure out what you're going to do about your suppliers, which is why it's unfortunate that we were talking about earlier. Lockheed might not put their blog memo out until the day the rule goes into effect. But that's also why they've been sending out questionnaires all along saying, you're ready to go, right? Like you told us, you implemented the requirements. So when this thing goes live, we can still send you the data. Yes. And that's, everybody knows the situation. This is not news to anybody, right? Everyone knows people have been calling the bluff that they'll never come and check. And now they don't know what to do. So call us because you definitely need the help. You're going to have a bunch of people that are going to need to be put into compliant environments. And, you're the one that's liable for flowing the data to people who aren't compliant at that point. So, all righty, let's see here. Phase 1 contract awards won't require certification until the start of phase 2, right? Maybe. So we did a podcast on this a couple of weeks ago. You can check that out. The way that people are interpreting the phased rollout is they're saying there will be no level 2 certification requirements for the first 12 months. What we are telling people is you need to be very careful with that assumption because the last line of the 32 CFR policy for phase 1 says, per DoD's discretion, they can require level 2 certification for applicable requirements. And that's all it says. That should make you nervous because if you're working with some very sensitive type of data, if you're working with program managers or types of programs where they're going to be very on the ball with what's going on with security, which you may not be privy to, depending on how far down the supply chain you are, you could easily be asked for a level 2 certification, especially if you work on the other side of the Lockheeds, the Raytheons, the Northrops of the world. There is no policy language that prohibits the inclusion of a level 2 certification requirement during phase 1. So be very careful about assuming that you will not see that requirement. There's going to be a lot of people that get the level 2 self-assessment requirement. There's going to be a non-zero number of people who get a level 2 certification requirement. And most people out there, if they zig instead of zag and they bet on self-assessment and get the certification assessment, they're probably not going to be able to pivot in time. So just be very careful by making that assumption. The policy is not by any means airtight for phase 1. Check out the podcast episode that we did. You go through, we even linked to the policies. You can read them yourselves. Not everybody's going to require level 2 certification assessment, but not everybody's going to get a self-assessment requirement either. So
also your prime, if you're a sub, could require requirements above and beyond what the DoD does if they want, because they need to ensure compliance with their supply chain. So they know what kind of contracts they can pursue. So just be aware, it's not only what the DoD is putting on solicitations, but what is your prime going to demand of you so they can hedge their own bets.
Yeah. A good example of how guidance like this can change pretty quickly is the DoD has always said that CMMC level 3 requirements are going to affect like less than 1% of the DIB out there. And then now several years later, Golden Dome is a new idea. And the way that has trickled down in the memos that we've sort of seen leaking around out there is that a lot of people under the umbrella of Golden Dome are going to require CMMC level 3, which is definitely going to be more than 1% of the DIB. So even though CMMC policy, when it was written, intended for very few people to have CMMC level 3, Golden Dome is a new variable in terms of what's going on. Not that anybody could have predicted it. That's just the way that it goes. So assuming that you're going to get a level 2 self-assessment in phase 1 is a big assumption. So just be careful when you make it, realize the nature of the risk that you're taking, and good luck to you. So
very much so.
All right, a couple of classic rapid fire questions here for episode 50. Will CMMC apply to me, Daniel?
Yes.
What is CUI?
Well, depending on who you ask, it is a specific type of data governed by a law, regulation, or government-wide policy that you can only have introduced if you have a federal contract. It is not private or proprietary or COTS information or fundamental research. So yeah, you have to have a federal contract and it has to have a law, regulation, government-wide policy dictating that it is controlled and classified information.
How much does it cost?
So many monies. Over 6 figures is kind of the going joke, I guess you could say. I mean, we're seeing small businesses having to spend over $100,000 full all in, including their assessment.
To be clear, that's not the cost of your CMMC assessment. That is the cost of implementation to get to the CMMC assessment. And technically, right, by the letter of the regulations, DFAR 7012 makes you implement these requirements. So your implementation cost is not a CMMC cost. People mix these up because this is the first time they're hearing about it, but yeah, there you go.
An average assessment runs between 40 and 80K from what we've seen, but because these are commercial entities doing assessments, it's also going to be a little supply and demand driven from a price point. So if you are waiting to the last minute, if you've done your implementation, but waiting the last minute to get certified, which I wouldn't know why you would do, that price will probably be ticking up pretty rapidly since that November 10th date is officially established.
Yeah, absolutely. When should I start?
Yesterday. It's already too late. We make the joke. You can be early to CMMC, you can be late, but you can't be on time. The on-time window has gone. Like there is no perfect timing of CMMC for you anymore. And you've definitely didn't start early enough. So you're going to be late. You need to start immediately. You need to escalate this corporate risk to the highest levels of executives because of one thing that Jacob said earlier. There's something called the PALT, which I can't remember the acronym. Basically, the time it takes to award post-solicitation.
Yep.
On average, it's 32-ish days. The GAO did a report on this. So if you have to be compliant with these requirements within 32 days, number one, that's impossible. Just hard stop. You won't be able to win business. So your executives need to understand their delay in this will actually have an outcome of them not winning awards. And if you are asked to falsify records of your cybersecurity score at a level 1 or level 2 as part of this phase 1 rollout, run away, call a lawyer, and have yourself a wonderful little payday on an island somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, Daniel, it's been an hour. That's our 50th hour so far, episode 50 of the hotline, which is pretty incredible. So thanks everybody, since you guys have been sticking around. It only works if everybody asks questions. So, I mean, that's really the only reason we've gotten to 50 is because of all the awesome questions. So thanks everybody for sticking with us as the show has evolved over time through technical difficulties and random locations and, you know, all the awesome questions. I mean, we've been able to turn out amazing blogs, webinars, awesome full podcast episodes based off of some of the questions that people have asked. I think it's super valuable because you get new people on the hotline all the time asking questions that we forget are questions because we've been in the space for so long. It helps to keep the content relevant and useful and helpful for everybody because, you know, we don't ask what DFAR 7012 is internally anymore, but it's a super important question for people who are new. So this show and the content is what you guys need based off of the questions. So thanks to everybody who's always checked it out. We do it every week, which is awesome. And an hour feels about right. I don't know if an hour and a half would be too much. I feel like anything less than an hour wouldn't be enough. But what do you guys think moving forward for the next 50 episodes? You know, is this the right schedule? Is this the right time slot? Is this the right amount of questions? What do you want to see? What do you want us to do? And there you go. Hopefully we'll see you for 50 more.
51. See you guys.